Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, my favorite series. Not the most popular, but in many ways, I think the most interesting and the most important. And today we are up to Symphony number 56 in C major. Now, we are embarking on a new phase of the Haydn Symphony Crusade because these are some of the least known and almost disregarded symphonies, the post-Sturm und Drang. There's this period from the late 50s or so up into really the 80s, basically, almost 30 symphonies where Haydn has abandoned his Sturm und Drang style, that is that tense, anguished, minor key, highly experimental phase. And then he had to focus most of his attention working for the Esterházy family on opera production. And so he was really busy. And what people say about these symphonies is that because he was so busy, a lot of them incorporate music that he wrote for the theater and stuff like that. And also that they're entertaining, but they're not emotionally deep. I take exception to that. I really do. This symphony is a case in point, actually, because it has a slow movement, which is one of the most profoundly beautiful things that anybody ever wrote. I mean, it's really amazing. And a glorious thing. And we're going to hear that. So you'll hear that in a minute. You'll see what I mean. But the truth of the matter is that Haydn did not abandon his Sturm und Drang style. He incorporated it. He synthesized it. And so to ignore these symphonies or to say, well, they're not all in minor keys and they're not all about angst and misery means they must not be important is a big mistake, a huge mistake, because what we are beginning to see now is the mature symphonic style of like Western civilization emerging as a result of what Haydn learned in writing his Sturm und Drang symphonies. And again, this symphony is a case in point. So let's talk about it and see what it has to tell us, because that's, what this is all about. Now, the symphony is in C major, and C major for Haydn usually means with trumpets and drums and high horns, and this is one of those. So it's brassy sounding. The woodwind section only consists of two oboes and a bassoon. And oh my God, what a difference that makes, because Haydn has learned what to do with these small woodwind sections, as you will see. But, in a lot of these talks, we speak of how Haydn manages to achieve unity over the four movements of his symphony. But with these trumpet and drum things in C major, there may be additional elements that do that. But really all Haydn needs to do is have trumpets and drums. You've got unity by virtue of timbre, by virtue of the fact that three of the four movements are going to use those instruments. And right away, because they're there doing their fanfaring and stuff like that, you have a form of unity for the symphony. So Haydn doesn't have to worry about thematic or motivic interconnections and things like that. Although there are some overriding conceptual ideas that he pursues in this particular symphony. This is important. Though this is important because I've been at pains to stress throughout this particular crusade that a musical idea is not necessarily a tune. Of course, it is a tune, but it's a lot more. It could be a rhythm. It could be a sound, a timbre. It could be a structural idea. I mean, all of these things Haydn is incredibly conscious of. And Haydn was a careful and slow worker. I mean, he churned out 107 symphonies. People think he's just writing and it's all just tossing it off. And there were moments working for Prince Esterházy where you see his writing trail off. He's sitting there with a candle up until midnight trying to meet a deadline. So he was under pressure all the time to produce. But his musical fabrication is the result of serious thought and instinct. A sense of what matters, what will work and what won't work. And because he had his own personal orchestra there, the prince's orchestra, that he could basically ring his little bell and they could all truck in and he'd say, let's try this, guys, or let's see how that works. He knew what worked. He knew what would work and what wouldn't work. And so one of the things we need to keep in mind in this particular symphony is that the sound of trumpets and drums and horns is a brilliant thing in itself, but it's also a means of unifying the whole four-movement cycle. The other unifying principle in this work is a very simple idea. It's musical contrast. It's the contrast between big, powerful, brassy tutti, sections for the full orchestra, and very, very light, very graceful, very, very delicate ideas as well. And there's this pendulum that swings back and forth between these big explosions of sound and these very quiet, gentle replies. And that's also something. Now, you're going to hear that in any classical work that uses trumpets and drums, of course, because you're going to have the contrast between loud and soft. It's natural. But Haydn makes a point of it. The whole idea, and what makes these Haydn works special, isn't that they do the things that everybody else does, but that he understands why they do these things and understands that he can use the fact that they're going to do these things to achieve a larger structural goal. And that happens very, very clearly in this symphony. So what we're going to do is we're going to play, I have like 5 big examples here, and we're going to work our way through it. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, here we go. So we're going to begin with the complete exposition, the full exposition of the first movement, and then we're going to take it apart a little bit. So here it is with Helmut Muller-Brühl and the Cologne Chamber Orchestra on Naxos, and it's just, you'll hear very, very clearly this idea between big, loud, ba-doom, and gentler thematic replies throughout the entire exposition. You ready? Contrast, yes, big contrast, bold contrast. And also, this is a very long exposition. I mean, it's almost 2 minutes long, 2 minutes worth of music, which is a lot of music in classical terms. You know, when we started this crusade with Haydn's earlier symphonies, we were talking about expositions that were maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds if you were pushing it, And now you can see how the amount of material he's using is expanding. The contrasts are bigger and bolder. And what I want to emphasize in this exposition, and then you can go listen to the rest of the movement yourself. It's very, very delightful. And there's, you can enjoy and savor its details independently. But the exposition really uses this idea of contrast between loud and soft, big and little, if you want to call it that way, both on a small scale, right at the very opening, right? With that big noisy thing and the gentle answer, but also on a larger structural way in the contrast between the first subject and the second subject. Now, we're going to take this movement apart a little bit. You remember the opening, which I just played, and then what I want to play is the motion music, the music that gets us from that first theme, that big contrasty first theme, to the second subject, the second theme. And again, by subject, by theme, again, by these things, it can be anything. It can be tunes or rhythms or whatever. There can be multiple tunes. It's not just one thing necessarily. The motion music in this particular symphony, first movement exposition, is very, very interesting. And it's interesting because it really takes us on a trip. You may not be thinking about it that way, but if you listen to it separately, you'll see exactly what I mean. And what I want you to focus on is this. Quite often in classical symphonies, the motion music ends with a full stop, comes to a full stop, and then the second subject comes in its own unique key. And that stop is very satisfying. It's a cadence. It's a really, nice, firm dum-ba-da-dum-bum-bum, and then the music will go on. Well, this does come to a full stop, but there is no way in hell that you're going to believe that the stop that it comes to is an ending, is a perfect cadence. The music has to continue. It absolutely must. And this is a new thing. This is creating sections that require resolution in other sections. It's something that Haydn learned to do fairly early on, but here it's incredibly clear how this motion music somewhat drifts off and ends on a dissonant chord, a dissonance, a strange harmony, and something has to come next. Here is the motion music, just that motion music. Yeah, it can't stop there, can it? It's puzzled. It's confused. It's asking us what's going to happen next, and what happens next is this. So there you have that large contrast between loud and soft operating on the basis of the larger thematic substance of the first movement, because that first movement is quite boisterous, although it has loud and soft elements, right? The alternation of loud and soft, but it's basically pretty bangy. And then you've got this motion music that is also pretty bangy, but then trickles out into a passage of deep uncertainty. And suddenly the clouds part, the sun comes out, and we hear that lovely second subject. Da 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 dum bum 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 ba dum ba da 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 dum bum 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 ba dum. It's so beautiful, and it's so wonderful because of the contrast. And that's what Haydn is telling us. He's saying, listen to the contrast between what came before and what this second subject does. It answers all of the questions that the music was starting to ask. So that's lovely. And that brings, then of course, all the noise comes blustering back in, and the exposition comes to an end. And you can play the rest of the first movement. Now, the second movement leaves out the trumpets and drums. And so Haydn is going to have to exploit the idea of contrast in a completely different way. And he does. And he does it in the most wonderful possible way. Oh my goodness. You can hear it right at the opening. You hear a lovely, lovely theme in the strings, muted strings. It's just delicious. It's wonderful. And then that's repeated by the pair of oboes and bassoon, by the woodwinds, that little tiny little woodwind section. And they repeat the music identically. And then after they repeat the music identically, there is a gorgeous aria for solo bassoon. Now, a solo bassoon is not normally, it's not usually an instrument that people use as a lyrical solo instrument. But It sure as hell works here. Oh my gosh, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous tune, a beautiful aria for the bassoon soloist. And I really wonder if more orchestral bassoonists knew about this piece, they would be pushing their orchestras to play it more often because it really gives the principal bassoon an opportunity to shine. Whenever this happens in Haydn, by the way, people talk about how, oh, it's actually a missing movement from a concerto, or it evokes the Baroque concerto grosso concept where you have groups of soloists against the large orchestra. It's all garbage. I'm telling you, it's garbage. Haydn's symphonies are as much concertos for orchestra as they are anything else. Every instrument matters in them, and he wants to give them all something to do because they were his buddies in the orchestra at Esterhazy. And so they're always going to have wonderful, rewarding solo bits, and he integrates these solo bits into the wider concept of the symphony. Here, the contrast is between the strings and the woodwind section. And the writing for woodwinds here is so exquisite, especially after the bassoon solo. The music continues, and you have the strings playing the themes that are taken over by the oboes. This seamless, beautiful integration between the melody and the strings, passed off to the oboes, passed back to the strings. It's really one of the most beautiful and exquisite slow movements from the entire classical period. It really is, I think. And nobody knows it. Nobody pays attention to it. It blows my mind that people don't seem to know that that's there. And I just want you to listen to the whole exposition. It's a sonata form movement, like the first movement, more or less. And you can hear just how incredibly, incredibly sensitive and profoundly lovely this music is. Anyone who says that this music is inexpressive, or that it's reflects Haydn's impatience or lack of time or anything, they're on drugs. I mean, it's just crazy. Listen to this. Just pay attention and listen to what's going on here. makes you sweat, doesn't it? I mean, it's just so lovely. My God. Now, the minuet, we don't need to focus on for two reasons. Number one is the actual body of the minuet. The main minuet is a big, grand, 3/4 dance-like paraphrase of exactly what we heard in the first movement. That is, big outbursts for the full orchestra with trumpets and horns and drums, and very soft answers. So the concept that Haydn has created in his exposition in the first movement is the model on which the minuet is based. That's all you need to know about it. The other thing about this minuet, which was the subject of an entirely independent video, which you should see if you haven't by yet, it's on Tips on Critical Listening, and it's called The Joy of Irregular Phrasing. And that's the trio, the central section of the minuet, which is a beautiful, beautiful melody for strings and oboe. And the most wonderful thing about it is that the phrasing on the second half of the trio overlaps, so that the return of the first part begins before the end of the second part. I mean, it's just wonderful. You have to go watch that video. I'm not going to play it all again because I've covered it. I cover it in excruciating detail there. But it just is another one of those wonderful moments where Haydn takes what's usually just a throwaway moment in a symphony, this contrasting middle section to the minuet, and does something absolutely amazing and unexpected. So that's the minuet. Now the finale really synthesizes this idea of contrast that we've been talking about the whole time. It's a tarantella or a saltarello or something like that. One of those Italian dances in 6/8 or 9/8 or one of those rhythms. It's one of those Italian folk dance type things. But like all of Haydn's dances, it does weird things. It does it with the rhythm. He's never going to let his dancers get out of this thing without at least tripping over something, whether it's their partner or themselves or something on the floor. I mean, it has odd pauses in weird places. And so the contrast is not just between loud and soft. It's also between music and silence. That's sort of the way it's going. So it's got strange rhythms, interesting. It's all about this contrast between regular and irregular rhythm, which we heard in the trio of the minuet. There's all kinds of fun stuff going on, which highlights this idea of contrast between one thing and the other thing, and its direct diametrical opposite. And so all you need to do is keep that in mind, that concept of contrast. And then I'm going to play the whole movement without the exposition repeat. It's a long movement with the repeat, about 4 minutes, which is a big finale. It's a big finale at this period in a classical symphony. And it's wonderful in the way that it just summarizes everything that we've heard before in terms of concept, not melody, not tunes, but in terms of the concepts that Haydn has been exploiting. But it does it in a way which is completely and wonderfully unique to itself and satisfying and fun to listen to. So let's listen to this amazing little Italian tarantella finale. There's a couple of these, by the way. Haydn liked the tarantella at this period. He was having fun with it, as you'll hear in the upcoming chats. Here it is. It's all about the contrast, right? It's all about these wonderful, wonderful things that Haydn can do with loud and soft and music and silence and regular and irregular rhythm and all that stuff. And that's what the symphony is about. It's really that simple. And because it's not about, for example, like, death and misery, people think, oh, well, it's not emotionally deep. It's very deep. It's very profound. It's a profound way of working with the materials of music, of creating something incredibly communicative out of basic musical ideas. And this is what Haydn really gained from his experience in his Sturm und Drang period, from writing those emotionally rather intense pieces and lopsided, emotionally imbalanced pieces, when he went back to trying to integrate all of that into a wider, larger, richer, more varied symphonic style. And if we ignore these middle symphonies, the next 20 some odd symphonies or so, we're going to really be the poorer in our understanding of what symphonic technique is, and how Haydn led the charge for creating the symphony and the symphony orchestra, out of which all of Western orchestral music emerged. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.